Imagine, if you will, you're looking at the global news cycle over the last couple of years. And if you've been following international headlines at all, there is a specific country that might immediately come to mind.
But probably for all the wrong reasons, right?
Exactly. I mean, for all the wrong reasons. You're picturing severe economic crises. You're seeing footage on the news of, stalled growth, massive inflation, fuel shortages.
Just long lines of people waiting for basic goods.
Right, exactly. A national economy that, by all traditional metrics, essentially hit a concrete wall. And if you were just reading the standard financial ledgers, well, the diagnosis is pretty bleak. The story seems over.
Which is honestly how most people consume global news.
Yeah.
We look at the gross domestic product, the national income, and we make this immediate judgment about a society's success or failure.
But I've been digging through the data stack we have for today's deep dive, and it introduces this absolute bombshell. It completely upends that entire narrative.
It really does. It flips it on its head.
It totally does. Because when you take this exact same country with all of those highly publicized economic struggles and you apply a different lens, a new cutting-edge global metric that actually factors in the health of the planet, this struggling nation doesn't just improve a little bit.
No, it skyrockets.
It rockets past heavily industrialized, incredibly wealthy countries. It jumps a staggering 47 spots in the global rankings, catapulting from number 89 all the way up to number 27.
Which is an absolute statistical anomaly. I mean, you just don't see jumps like that. And the country we are looking at today is Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka.
Yeah. And that massive 47 rank jump, it forces us to completely reevaluate our baseline assumptions about what human progress actually looks like.
So today's deep dive is fundamentally about a mystery. I'm your host, and joined as always by our resident data expert. We are redefining what success and development actually mean in the 21st century.
Because the old definitions just aren't holding up anymore.
No, they aren't. We have this massive, comprehensive data stack regarding Sri Lanka's development, and we are going to unpack it layer by layer for you.
Right, we're looking at standard human development, how inequality distorts that picture, the massive and hidden gender divide, and finally that environmental footprint metric that causes that insane rank jump we just mentioned.
Because traditional economics, it operates on a very deeply entrenched, almost invisible assumption, doesn't it?
Yeah, it assumes that relentless compounding economic growth is the singular engine of human development.
Right. If you aren't growing, you're dying.
Exactly. The underlying belief is that if a nation's income isn't skyrocketing, well, the country is obviously failing as citizens. But this specific data set forces us to interrogate that assumption entirely.
It really asks a radical question. Is it physically and mathematically possible to cultivate our highly educated, long-living, healthy population without, consuming the earth in the process?
Spoiler alert, it might just be.
So let's unpack this like a detective story, because I really want to understand the actual mechanics of how this happens.
Sure.
How does a nation with a stalled economy become a top-tier model for sustainable development?
Well, to understand that jump to number 27, we can't just start at the end of the story.
Right, we have to establish the baseline.
Exactly. How does Sri Lanka look through the traditional lens of human development? Before we even look at the environment, what is the raw human experience there?
Right. And to measure that baseline, we rely on the Human Development Index, or the HDI.
And for anyone unfamiliar with how this is calculated, it was actually created to push back against the idea that money just equals progress.
Right. It's not just about GDP.
No, it emphasizes that people and their actual capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing a country. So it measures 3 specific dimensions.
Which are?
A long and healthy life, access to knowledge, so exactly how many years of schooling people get, and finally, a decent standard of living, which is the economic component.
Okay, so looking at the 2023 data from our sources, Sri Lanka maintains what is officially classified as a high human development status.
Yeah.
Its score is 0.776.
Right, and context is literally everything here.
It is, because the world average is 0.756.
Wow.
Yeah, so right out of the gate, despite all the negative news headlines you might have seen, Sri Lanka is actually outperforming the global average in raw human development.
And the achievements become even more striking when you isolate the individual components of that aggregate score. Health is a perfect starting point here.
Oh, the health data is wild.
It is. The expected life expectancy at birth in Sri Lanka is 77.5 years.
I honestly had to read that number twice when I was prepping for this.
Yeah.
77.5.
Yeah.
because the global average life expectancy is only 73.4 years.
Right. So Sri Lankans are living, on average, a full 4 years longer than the typical global citizen.
4 extra years of life. That is huge. And if you track the historical data back to, say, 1990, Sri Lanka's life expectancy was around 69.2 years.
So they have systematically added nearly a decade to the lifespan of their population over just the last 3 decades.
Which begs the question, how are they pulling that off without the massive bloated budgets of a Western nation?
Well, it comes down to a long-standing structural commitment to public health. I mean, they didn't just recently decide to invest in hospitals. This is the result of decades of universal healthcare policy.
Right, it's baked into the system.
Exactly. They've built an infrastructure completely focused on preventative care, maternal health, and widespread clinic access, even in deeply rural areas.
Wow.
It basically proves that you don't necessarily need the highest GDP in the world to keep people alive and healthy, provided the state prioritizes human infrastructure over purely industrial expansion.
And we see that exact same philosophy applied to education.
Right.
The expected years of schooling in Sri Lanka is 13.1 years, which is just edging out the global average of 13.0.
But the metric that really matters, the one that shows what's actually happening on the ground with real people, is the mean years of schooling.
Okay, explain the difference there for a second.
Sure. Mean years of schooling is the actual average number of years of education received by people ages 25 and older. So it's not a projection, it's what has actually been achieved.
Got it. And for Sri Lanka, that number is an impressive 10.8 years.
Right. And back in 1990, that number was just 8.5 years.
So you are looking at a population that is not only living significantly longer than the global average, but one that is highly educated.
Highly educated, the state has successfully built this incredible social foundation through free education and universal health care. The human capital is undeniably there.
But, and this is a huge but,
Yeah.
here is where we hit the wall on the data. The numbers show this harsh, undeniable plateau hitting right around 2019.
Which lines up with the broader economic crises we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Sri Lanka's gross national income per capita, which is that third pillar of the index, the standard of living, it doesn't just stall. It completely plummets.
It falls off a cliff.
It really does. In 2018, the national income per capita was roughly $14,380. But by 2023, it had dropped all the way down to $12,616.
And while their income was shrinking, the global average kept rising, currently sitting at over $20,000.
That's a massive gap.
It is. And this is the central friction of the entire Sri Lankan model right here.
I was trying to conceptualize this, and it feels like a brilliant high school student.
Okay, I like this.
Imagine a kid who gets straight A's in health.
Yeah.
They get straight A's in education. They are doing everything right on paper. But suddenly they hit a brick wall and completely fail economics, and they can't get a job anywhere.
That's actually a great analogy.
It's a paradox, right?
Right.
You have high social progress crashing headfirst into a severe financial reality.
The challenge with that brilliant student is figuring out what happens next, because what this data reveals is both the profound strength and the massive vulnerability of prioritizing social infrastructure without a stable macroeconomic engine.
Right.
Investments in healthcare and education create a robust, capable population. But what good is a long, highly educated life if the economic opportunities available to you are actively shrinking?
Yeah. If you spend 13 years in school and you graduate completely healthy, but the national income is contracting, where do you go?
Exactly. What happens to all that accumulated human potential?
You end up with highly educated, healthy people just staring into an economic void, which actually explains a lot of the political unrest we've seen in the news, doesn't it?
It really puts it into perspective. People aren't just hungry. They are educated, capable, and deeply frustrated because the system can't utilize them.
And that realization forces us to look deeper into the numbers, because an average HDI score of 0.776, it paints a really smooth picture over a very bumpy reality.
Averages can be incredibly deceiving.
They really can. To figure out what's really happening on the ground, we have to apply an inequality filter. We need to see who is being left behind in that neat little average.
Right, because the Standard Development Index is just an aggregate. So the United Nations uses an Inequality Adjusted Index, or the IHDI, to ask a vital question. Okay, your overall score is high, but how equally are those benefits, the health, the education, the wealth distributed among your actual citizens.
And spoiler alert, every single country's score drops when you apply this filter.
Every single one. The metric we actually care about is the size of that drop.
So according to the data, when adjusting for inequality, Sri Lanka loses 18.8% of its overall development score.
Now, at first glance, losing nearly a fifth of your progress sounds terrible.
It sounds awful.
But you have to compare it. The global average loss due to inequality is actually 22.0%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so structurally, Sri Lanka is actually doing better than the rest of the world at distributing human development.
On the aggregate, sure. However, when we break down that 18.8% loss into its specific components, a massive structural flaw is exposed in the data.
Right, because the index separates inequality into three buckets: life expectancy, education, and income.
And Sri Lanka's inequality in life expectancy is remarkably low, right? Just 4.7%.
Yep. And inequality in education is also relatively low at 11.2%.
Which totally makes sense. If healthcare is universal and education is practically free, the gap between the rich and the poor in those specific areas shouldn't be massive. The state safety nets are actually doing their jobs.
They are. But the loss due to income inequality specifically, that is an astonishing 36.6%.
36.6%. That is a staggering disparity.
It really is.
It means the wealth that does exist in the country is concentrating heavily at the very top, leaving a massive portion of the population behind financially, even if they can, still go to the doctor or attend school.
And to understand the day-to-day texture of that inequality, we have to look at another metric, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI.
Right, because this goes beyond just counting dollars.
Exactly. It looks at the actual deprivations people experience in their homes, things like access to clean cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, electricity, housing, and assets.
It's the real lived experience of poverty.
Yes. And the baseline data from 2016 shows an overall poverty headcount of only 2.9% of the population.
Which sounds like a massive victory, honestly.
Yeah.
Less than 3% in multidimensional poverty.
Right.
But the source data breaks down the actual drivers of this poverty. Like, what is actually keeping that 2.9% down?
And this is the part of the data stack that is just fascinating.
It genuinely confused me at first. Education contributes about 14.5% to the poverty index, but the glowing red flag, the absolute biggest driver of deprivation, is nutrition.
Nutrition.
It drives 30.3% of the multidimensional poverty in Sri Lanka.
It is the single largest contributing factor. By far.
I really struggled with this. I mean, I'm looking at a country with a phenomenal healthcare system, driving life expectancy 4 years past the global average.
Right.
We just spent 10 minutes talking about how widespread their access to education is.
Right.
How can you have a society where the hospitals are world-class, the schools are full, but basic nutrition is the leading cause of poverty? It feels like those two realities shouldn't be able to exist in the same ZIP code.
I know, it's totally counterintuitive, but it's a fundamental disconnect between public infrastructure and household purchasing power.
Okay, unpack that.
Excellent. State-funded schools and well-staffed public hospitals do not automatically fix broken agricultural supply chains. They don't magically offset soaring food inflation.
Oh, I see. So you can walk into a free clinic when you are sick, and the doctor is highly trained and fixes you up. But when you walk out, you still don't have the cash in your pocket to buy caloric-dense, nutritious food because the economy is stalled.
That is the exact mechanism. You have a macroeconomic environment where the national income is shrinking, and as we saw, income inequality is sky high at 36.6%.
Right.
So the lowest tier earners are being entirely squeezed out of the food market.
Wow.
The social infrastructure, the hospitals, they are acting as a buffer. They treat the symptoms of poverty, preventing a total collapse in life expectancy, which is why the overall poverty headcount is so low. But for those caught at the very bottom, the economic system is failing them at the most foundational biological level.
That is so dark, but it makes so much sense. And I want to connect this to the listener for a second, because it's really easy to look at national nutrition stats from another country and think it doesn't apply to a modern developed lifestyle.
For sure.
But think about the hidden costs in your own life. You might live in a wealthy city. You might have access to incredible public parks, great libraries, and a seemingly high standard of living. But if housing costs or inflation are quietly eating up 60% of your income, your personal financial stability is an illusion masked by the wealthy infrastructure around you.
That's a perfect parallel.
Sri Lanka's nutrition gap is just a macro version of that. The average looks great, but the hidden foundational cost is crushing the people at the bottom.
And if we really want to trace exactly where that income inequality stems from, if we want to find out who is missing out on the wealth, we have to look at exactly half of the population.
We have to look at the gender divide.
Yes.
This is, without a doubt, the most frustrating paradox in the entire data stack.
It's maddening.
The Gender Development Index, or GDI, measures the gap in human development achievements between men and women. Sri Lanka is placed in Group 2, which indicates a medium to high equality gap. In 2023, their GDI value was 0.951.
And when you look at the raw human development numbers, the female HDI score is 0.750, which is lagging noticeably behind the male score of 0.791.
So to understand the actual mechanics of that gap, the data provides the Gender Inequality Index, or GII.
Right, which measures reproductive health, empowerment, and economic status.
Let's start with reproductive health, because
Yeah.
the data here is nothing short of miraculous. Sri Lanka's maternal mortality rate is just 29 deaths per 100,000 live births.
29.
Let that sink in. The global average is 216 deaths per 100,000. Sri Lanka is operating in a completely different universe of maternal health care.
It's incredible, and if you look back to 1990, it was 59 per 100,000. So they took an already relatively low number and literally cut it in half.
It is a staggering public health triumph, and we see a parallel victory in empowerment, specifically through education. A stunning 81.1% of Sri Lankan women ages 25 and older have at least some secondary education.
81.1%. The world average is only 62.0%.
Wow.
So you have a female population that is incredibly healthy, surviving childbirth at rates far better than the global average, and they are vastly more educated than the typical global citizen.
But here is the structural tragedy. Here is the glass ceiling.
Yep, here it comes.
Despite being highly educated and incredibly healthy, female representation in the Sri Lankan parliament is an abysmal 5.3%.
5.3%.
The world average is 26.5%.
And that lack of political power bleeds directly into the economy. Female labor force participation is stuck at exactly 32.0%.
While the global average is around 47%.
Right. Meanwhile, Sri Lankan male labor force participation is way up at 70.4%.
That is a massive gap. Let me put a finer point on that income disparity, because it absolutely answers our earlier question about income inequality. According to the 2023 data, the estimated gross national income per capita for women in Sri Lanka is $7,894.
Okay.
For men, it is $18,637.
Wow.
Men are capturing more than double the nation's wealth, simply because women are largely excluded from the formal labor force.
I know you're trying to come up with an analogy for this earlier.
I was, because reading the raw numbers is just infuriating.
Right.
It is like a country spending years and massive amounts of national treasure building a fleet of state-of-the-art, high-performance sports cars.
Okay, I see where you're going.
You invest in top-tier engineering, that's the 81% secondary education.
Yeah.
You invest in premium, world-class maintenance, that's the maternal health and life expectancy. You build this incredible, powerful machine, and then you just leave it permanently parked and locked in the garage.
It is an egregious misallocation of human capital. The state literally pays to educate them, keeps them perfectly healthy, and then structurally prevents them from generating economic returns.
But why is the garage locked? I mean, how does a country with such high female education tolerate a 32% labor force participation rate? If they are educated, why aren't they working?
Well, because education does not automatically translate to economic power if societal structures demand that women bear the exclusive burden of unpaid care work.
Ah, right.
You can have a high school diploma or a university degree, but if cultural norms dictate that your primary, non-negotiable role is domestic raising children, caring for elderly family members, maintaining the household, you simply cannot deploy that education in the formal economy.
So there's a lack of infrastructure, too. Like, if there's no accessible childcare, or if workplaces don't offer flexible hours, an educated woman physically cannot leave the home to work no matter how badly she wants to.
Exactly. Furthermore, that abysmal 5.3% representation in parliament ensures the garage stays locked.
Right, because who is going to change the laws?
Exactly. Women have virtually no political power to dismantle these structural barriers. There are simply not enough female lawmakers in the room advocating for policies that would integrate women into the workforce, things like mandated maternity leave, subsidized childcare, or anti-discrimination labor laws.
It's a brutal, self-sustaining cycle. No women in power means no policies to help women get into the workforce, which means women have no economic power, which means they can't fund political campaigns to gain leverage to get into power.
It feeds itself.
It really does. And this circles all the way back to the economic stagnation we discussed at the very beginning. What happens to a nation's economy when nearly 70% of its highly educated female talent is entirely absent from the formal labor force?
The national income plummets. You cannot sustain long-term macroeconomic growth with half of your most capable workforce completely sidelined. Sri Lanka's economic crisis is deeply, inherently intertwined with this gender paradox. The human capital isn't missing, it is just sitting dormant, trapped by cultural and structural barriers.
You know, if we stopped our deep dive right here,
Yeah,
the narrative would be incredibly bleak.
very depressing.
We have a country with a stalled national income, massive income inequality, masking a hidden nutrition crisis, and deeply entrenched gender barriers, keeping educated women out of the economy. By traditional 20th century metrics, Sri Lanka looks like a cautionary tale.
But traditional metrics are exactly what this data stack is challenging today. Because this brings us to the plot twist that completely redefines everything we've just talked about.
Yes, this is the part of the source material that genuinely blew my mind. Enter the PHCI metric.
The Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
It's a mouthful, but it's brilliant.
The United Nations developed this relatively recently. It takes the Standard Index, which measures health, education, and standard of living, and it mathematically discounts a country's score based on the environmental damage it causes to achieve that development.
It essentially asks, okay, you have a great standard of living, you have wealth and education, but how much of the earth did you have to destroy to get it?
Right. It focuses on two specific environmental footprints: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
Okay, let's look at Sri Lanka's environmental footprint in the data. Their per capita CO2 emission is a mere zero point 0.9 tons.
zero point 0.9 tons.
To put that in perspective for you, the listener, the world average is a heavy 4.5 tons. Sri Lanka is producing a tiny fraction of the global average of carbon emissions.
The material footprint is equally revealing. This measures the amount of raw materials, biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metal minerals extracted to meet domestic consumption.
Basically, how much stuff you're pulling out of the ground.
Exactly. Sri Lanka's material footprint is just 4.1 tons per capita.
Wow.
The world average is more than triple that, sitting at 12.7 tons.
So their environmental footprint is incredibly light. And here is where the math creates that staggering leap we mentioned in the very first minute of this show.
The 47-spot jump.
Yes. When the UN takes the human development scores and deducts the planetary damage, the world average index score drops by a massive 10.1%. All of these wealthy, highly industrialized nations take a huge penalty to their scores because they are pumping out carbon and devouring raw materials to maintain their wealthy lifestyles.
But Sri Lanka's score, it only drops by 2.8%.
Because their footprint is so incredibly small, they barely get penalized. And that lack of a penalty catapults them into the global top tier for sustainable development. When you factor in planetary pressures, Sri Lanka jumps 47 spots, landing at rank 27 out of 166 countries.
Which is just wild to think about.
They rocket past heavily industrialized nations that look far more successful on a traditional GDP ledger, but are secretly bankrupting the planet's ecological systems.
It is a profound paradigm shift. It demonstrates mathematically that when you account for the actual physical survival of the planet, Sri Lanka's model of high life expectancy and high education, achieved with minimal environmental destruction, is vastly superior to the high consumption models of the West.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here.
I figured you would.
I pushed back hard on this when I was reading the sources. Is this massive jump in the rankings really a result of intentional, visionary green policies by the Sri Lankan government? Or is it just a circumstantial accident?
The intent versus outcome debate.
Right, because we just spent half an hour talking about how their economy is stalled, their national income's dropping, and women can't get into the workforce. Are they only low carbon because their industrial sector is broken?
It's a valid question.
If their economy finally recovers and their income goes up, won't their carbon footprint just skyrocket like everyone else's? Are we basically praising them for an accidental green footprint caused by economic failure?
That is the most important tension in this entire data stack. Is it intentional sustainability or circumstantial poverty?
Right.
The reality is likely a complex mix of both. They do have strong environmental protections in some areas, but the lack of heavy industry definitely keeps emissions low by default. However, and this is the crucial overarching insight of this entire analysis, it doesn't actually matter if it was accidental.
Wait, how can it not matter? If it's an accident, it's not a model we can replicate.
Because it provides physical, undeniable proof of a concept that many development economists doubted was even possible.
Okay.
It proves that a nation can achieve long, highly educated, healthy human lives without destroying the planet. For decades, the assumption was that to get your life expectancy up to 77 years and to get your secondary education over 80%, a country had to industrialize heavily.
They had to build factories and burn coal.
Exactly. They had to emit massive carbon. They had to consume vast materials. Sri Lanka's data proves that assumption entirely false. The social foundation, the long, educated life, can be built without the planetary destruction.
Wow. Okay, I see what you mean. It's a proof of concept. It entirely decouples human well-being from carbon emissions.
Look at the global policy landscape right now. Developed, wealthy nations are desperately trying to engineer their way backward. They're spending trillions trying to lower their massive carbon footprints without sacrificing their high standard of living.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
It is. But Sri Lanka is in the exact opposite position. They already have the low footprint. They already have the health and the education. They merely need to fix their economic structure.
They have the hardest parts already figured out. They have the education, the healthcare, the sustainable footprint. They just need to turn the key on the economic engine without resorting to dirty 20th century industrialization.
Which is why studying this specific country's data is so vital. It shows us an entirely different pathway to the future of human development.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, let's look at the whole board. Based on all the sources we've analyzed today, let's distill the core strengths, the vulnerabilities, and the path forward for the Sri Lankan model.
Well, the strengths are unequivocally clear in the data. Sri Lanka possesses an exceptionally high life expectancy, beating the global average by 4 years. They have widespread access to secondary education, particularly for women, where they exceed the global average by nearly 20 percentage points. And, crucially, they have an incredibly low carbon and material footprint, making them a statistical model of ecological efficiency.
But the weaknesses are equally stark, and they really threaten to undermine everything. There is a severe lack of female political power, with only 5.3% representation in parliament.
Which is just unacceptable.
There is a massive, untapped female labor force, with almost 70% of educated women sitting outside the formal economy. There is an alarming decline in national income over the last 5 years. And looking beneath the surface, there is that hidden, nutrition-based poverty trap that disproportionately stars the lowest earners despite the strong healthcare system.
So, to transition from an economic cautionary tale to the ultimate model of 21st century development, they must execute two specific actions.
Okay, what's step one?
First, they must optimize their gender inequality index. They have to release the massive economic potential of their highly educated female population. That requires removing structural barriers, investing heavily in the care economy to free up women's time, and radically increasing female political representation.
Basically, you have to unlock the garage and take the sports car out for a drive.
Exactly. And second, they must reverse the national income slide through strictly green economic growth. They cannot afford to trade their number 27 planetary rank for cheap, dirty industrialization.
Right, they can't go backwards to go forward.
No. They must find ways to monetize their highly educated workforce in sustainable sectors, perhaps digital services, sustainable agriculture, or high-value ecotourism, rather than reverting to heavy carbon-intensive manufacturing.
They have to prove that you can grow the economy without growing the carbon footprint.
That is the ultimate test for their future.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. Something for you to mull over as you go about your day. For decades, we have operated on a very specific, almost arrogant assumption in the West. We've assumed that the path of progress means the developing world must learn from the rich, industrialized world.
Right, that they need to catch up to us.
Exactly. We assume they must copy our economic models to finally succeed. But looking at this data and looking at the crushing, undeniable weight of planetary collapse we are all facing, what if we have it completely backwards?
What if, to survive the next century, the rich world actually needs to study the Sri Lankan model?
What if we are the ones who need to learn? We need to figure out how to cultivate long, highly educated, healthy lives without consuming the earth in the process. Sri Lanka's X-ray might look a little muddy when it comes to traditional economics, but when you look at the health of the planet, their diagnosis is vastly better than ours.
It really forces us to question the very metrics we use to define a successful civilization.
And that is exactly why we do what we do here. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Remember, true learning doesn't just happen when you memorize the statistics. It happens when you have the courage to question the metrics we use to measure success. We'll see you next time.